Okay, welcome to session 20, part B. Okay, now this one part I'm going to give you a little more details about how GNP and GDP is calculated. And I'm just going to go over the table 13.1 in chapter 13. Okay, this is key is that first, when we're calculating GNP, there's two ways to do it. One, you can look at the value added at each step of the way as goods change from intermediate products to what we'll call the final good. By the way, let me just emphasize one definition that's very important. We'll do a homework problem on this. Could show up on the exam. Difference between a final good and a finished good. So a finished good is something that is finished, that there's no more producing that needs to be done. There will not be any more steps in the production process. A final good is a finished good that's actually been sold to a customer. Okay. And for the moment, at least, we will assume that no used goods exist. Because you ask, well, what if that customer resells it a year later? As a used good. Well, if that's the case, we'd still say it's a finished good because that customer actually used it, actually consumed it before he or she sold it as a used good. So we'd still say it's finished. If there's someone who actually makes a transaction and use the good for consumption, we call it a finished good. Okay, now there's two different ways that you can compute the value of GNP or GDP. And one way, as I said, just look at all the value added along every stage in the production process. And so here is the example that the book gives. It says, let's suppose we're looking at a bookcase. Okay, so the bookcase begins as a tree. So a logger who doesn't have to buy, now maybe he has his equipment, but usually we don't count the equipment as part of the intermediate goods. So intermediate goods includes goods that you buy and that you transform into a finished product. The machinery used to make those, we usually call that capital. So in this case, the saws and tractors, trucks, whatever you use to haul the logs or cut the logs, we would not count as intermediate products. So the key, intermediate products, sometimes we'll say included in the intermediate products are the raw materials. Okay, in this case would be the tree. So the logger starts off, didn't have to buy the tree. Let's assume that the logger owns the land and so pays $0 for his raw materials and intermediate goods, and cuts down the tree with his own labor, his own saw. Once he does that, he sells the tree to a sawmill owner for $50. Okay, so the logger, we say, has created $50 worth of value. Started with $0 worth of intermediate products. He bought $0 worth of intermediate products, ended up selling $50 worth of intermediate products. Okay. Next, the sawmill owner buys that cut tree for $50, and then he makes that tree into boards, sells those boards to a woodworker for $75. Okay, so how much value added was created? Okay, that sawmill owner took $50, transformed it into $75 worth of intermediate goods. So he or she has added $25 worth of value to the economy. Okay, the next step is a woodworker buys those boards from the sawmill owner for $75, and then he makes those milled boards into a bookcase, and then he sells that bookcase to a retail store owner. Okay, and assume he sells it for $250. Okay, what's the value added of the woodworker? He began with 75, ended up bought $75 worth of intermediate products, sold these new intermediate products for $250. The difference is $175. So we would say that the woodworker added $175 worth of value to the economy. Okay. Finally, the bookcase, the retail store owner buys that bookcase for $250 and then sells it. The book says to you, you're the customer, for $400. What value did the retailer add to the economy? Well, we say it's just the difference of these two numbers, $150. Okay. So on each step of the way, we would say that value added, if we're using the value added method of computing GNP or GDP, we just add up all those numbers, we get $400. Okay. Now, the book says, let's assume for the moment that each of these steps take place in the same year. Okay. So that's, we'd say the GNP, say it's in 2020, the GNP, these people contributed $400 worth of GNP. And if they're all citizens and it's all within the U.S. borders, that's also GDP, contributed $400 worth of GDP to the economy. Now, easier way to do that, so it turns out just an identity, and there's probably a way to do a quick proof using some sort of laws of arithmetic, that if you just take all those numbers here in the right column, they necessarily have to add up to the final price at which the final good was sold. So it's sold in the end for $400. So that final price has got to equal all the value added. Okay. So an alternative way to compute GNP is just to look at all the final goods and just look at the prices of all the final goods that were sold and bought in that year, and that's an alternative way to give you GNP. Okay, now there is an issue though. The two methods will give you different numbers if all these goods were not created in the same year. So for instance, if the first three steps were done in 2021, the final step was, first three steps were done in 2020, final step was done in 2021. If we use the final method version, these things create no GNP for 2020, okay, but create $400 worth of GNP for 2021. On the other hand, if you use the value added method, the first three steps create, what's the sum of those numbers? 250 of those three numbers creates $250 worth of GNP for 2020 and $150 worth of GNP for 2021. Okay, so there's a little bit of difference in those two methods, but only when the product is not, all the steps of a product are not completed within the same year. Okay. Let's see. Did I talk what is this final price? Okay. That's the key that I want you to know for GNP. Difference between GNP, GDP. I want you to know that you use the finished product method or the value-added method when we're computing GNP. Now, there's a lot of little details. The book discusses some of them, and some very, very arcane details if you happen to get a job in the Commerce Department computing these things. Don't worry about those fine details. If I haven't put them up here, that's all you need to know. And including, so the book talks about how do you count unsold inventories, okay? So this bookcase is at the retailer, it's not sold. The book says, well, maybe there's a way you take the expected price that you're going to use. Don't worry about that, okay? Just assume that we don't have any unsold inventories, okay? And I don't need you to care about that detail. The other thing, what do you do about used goods? Okay. in our class, we're just going to assume there are no used goods. They are never bought and sold. Okay, so don't worry about how to how to account for used goods when calculating GNP or GDP. If one of you happens to get a job in the Commerce Department, then you'd need to worry about it. And the U.S. government has certain rules, and I imagine they actually probably vary across different countries. It's not, they may differ according to how they treat used goods in different countries. So, but the key is you don't need to worry about that for our class. Okay, then one final point while I'm at it. Notice the book. The last session, I said that the economy dropped, the GNP dropped about 25% during the Great Depression, and I compared it to Venezuela, which has dropped 60 or 65% in the last 5 years. I was slightly wrong. The book actually mentioned that the Great Depression, the GNP actually dropped 30%. So I was a little bit off. It's a little worse than I said in the last session. Okay, so quick trivia fact. Actually, I kind of want you to know that. Okay, about how much did the economy drop during the Great Depression? If you got something like 25 or 30%, something like that, I want you to know it was a lot. Okay, okay, that is session B, and I'll see you in session C.